Hello and welcome to another episode of Ask the Consistory. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Zabel of the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. Ask the Consistory is a small video series we do here on the Consistory of the coelc YouTube channel where we answer listener questions. Now, I was asked a question about what is the Lutheran view on polygamy. And so I'd actually like to give you the Lutheran and I argue biblical view on polygamy, and this comes from scripture and also Luther's own comments on the topic. So the issue of polygamy is not black and white. It's not like the question of same-sex marriage or sex before marriage or all those other things that the Bible clearly condemns. Polygamy is in this kind of grey area where it's not recommended but not condemned. It's not advised, it's not a good thing, but it's not actually condemned. So we could say polygamy is a bad thing, but it's not a sin. And so we see in Genesis 2:23 that it is clear that God intended marriage to be one man and one woman. You can see this also in the Gospels where Jesus references the creation of man and woman, that in the beginning God made them male and female. God intended for marriage to be one man and one woman. In Genesis it says that man will leave his father and his mother and cling to his wife singular. Yet throughout the Old Testament, polygamy occurs quite frequently, and nowhere is it explicitly called a sin. The Levitical laws do not condemn polygamy, but instead they actually give guidelines onto how to manage it. Such as in Leviticus 18:18, it says that if you are to take a second wife, you shouldn't marry your first wife's sister. So don't do like Jacob marrying Rachel and Leah. We also have in Deuteronomy 21:15-17 that it says if a man has two wives and each wife has a son, when he is giving out his inheritance, he has to give it to the firstborn son. He doesn't get to pick favorites based on which wife he prefers. So for example, in the case of Jacob, he liked Rachel more than he did Leah, but Leah gave birth to his firstborn son. So that inheritance should go to his firstborn son, not to Joseph, just because Joseph is the favored son, or Joseph is the son of his favored wife. Also, in Deuteronomy 25:5-10, there's the practice of levirate marriage in which a man has to marry his brother's widow and father children for his deceased brother so that his brother's inheritance can get passed on. In such a case, if the man was already married, this second wife would now make his marriage polygamous. And also we see in 2 Samuel 12:8 that God explicitly says that he gave Saul's wives to David. In this case, God is actually the result and cause of this polygamy. God is permitting polygamy in this case. He even tells David, when David goes and sleeps with Bathsheba, he's like, if I hadn't given you enough, ask me and I would have given you more. They're essentially implying that God's like, if you needed another wife, I would get you another wife. So here, polygamy is actually a divine act in this case. So polygamy may not be God's intended goal for marriage, but it is not forbidden in the scriptures. And we can see this taught by Martin Luther. Luther, in his Genesis commentary, comments on the polygamous practices of the patriarchs, to which he writes, "Advise it, I do not, forbid it, I cannot." So Luther says that he doesn't advise anyone to participate in polygamy, but he can't condemn it as a sin, because scripture does not condemn it as a sin. In fact, there was a whole big controversy around Luther's views on polygamy regarding the marriage of Philip the Landgrave of Hesse. He was married in 1523 to a sickly and, in his words, unattractive woman for political purposes. Within 3 weeks, he had already committed adultery. In 1526, he wrote to Luther and asked for the possibility of taking a second wife, since he could not sleep with his sickly wife. Philip had asked this as a hypothetical question. He didn't actually tell Luther the exact situation. Luther wrote back to him saying that he strongly advised against polygamy, especially in the case of Christians, but that if there was extreme necessity, as for example, if the wife was leprous or similarly affected, then polygamy would be okay. So Thus, Luther is saying that in such cases where a man could not have sex with his wife, it would be better for him to take a second wife rather than either divorce the first or fall into lustful passions and commit the sin of adultery. So, moving on to 1531, the Englishman Robert Barnes came and met with Luther and Philip Melanchthon, and he asked about the situation with King Henry VIII, who sought to divorce Catherine of Aragon. Melanchthon stated that polygamy was not absolutely forbidden by divine law, and for that sake he should avoid divorce and the political ramifications and should instead take a second wife. Luther also commented saying, "I would allow the king to take another queen according to the example of the ancient patriarchs and kings who had two wives at the same time." Now, returning to Philip of Hesse, he did find for himself a suitable woman to make his second wife, Margaretha von der Saal, the daughter of one of his sister's ladies-in-waiting. Margaretha only agreed to marry Philip if he could get permission from the theologians to do so. So on December 10th, 1539, Philip spoke with Luther and Melanchthon in private confession. He disclosed his long struggles with adultery and sought their permission for a second wife. Luther and Melanchthon gave Philip their approval. However, when the marriage became public, it was a huge scandal. Luther refused at first to acknowledge his approval of the relationship, as the advice had been given in private confession and was thus bound by the seal of the confessional. However, in a letter in 1540, Luther wrote regarding this whole controversy, where he said, "If such a matter as this of Phyllis came before me today, I would advise that I had already advised. I am not ashamed of such counsel, even if it should become before the whole world." Luther also wrote something very intriguing, and that is that he did not advise Philip to have a public marriage. Luther wrote that, "What I expected was that, since he was obliged, owing to the weakness of the flesh, to follow the ordinary course of sin and shame, he would perhaps keep an honest girl in some house and wed her secretly, though even this would look ill in the sight of the world, and thus overcome his great trouble of conscience. He could then ride backwards and forwards, as the great lords do frequently enough. Similar advice I also gave to certain parish pastors under Duke George and the bishops, namely, that they should marry their cooks secretly." So while polygamy is not condemned in the Bible, it is clearly advised against, as God's original design for marriage was one man and one woman. Now in Deuteronomy 17:17, it does say that kings are not to take many wives. However, we do see David having many wives and God actually approving and giving him the wives of Solomon. Many scholars have then argued that Deuteronomy 17 is not a prohibition against the king having multiple wives, as in a king being polygamous, but that the prohibition in Deuteronomy 17 is about the king not being covetous and accumulating to himself many wives, since the same passage also says that he shouldn't have many horses or much gold and silver. The king was allowed to have horses and allowed gold and silver, but he wasn't to be greedy. So he could have multiple wives, but not, greedy like Solomon and had like hundreds and stuff like that. However, if we turn to 1 Timothy 3:2, it does explicitly state that a pastor is to be the husband of one wife. So pastors are definitely clearly forbidden from Scripture from having a polygamous marriage. The only people that it seems to condemn being polygamous in the Bible are kings and pastors. This is because as heads of the state and heads of the church, we are examples to the flock. In 1 Peter 5:3, he states that shepherds should be examples to the flock. Now in the context of this, Peter is referring to pastors, but also if we turn to Ezekiel 34, God refers to kings as shepherds to the people. As leaders, we are to set good examples. Therefore, we should set the example of how marriage should be. One man and one woman for life, forsaking all others. So, to answer the question, what is the Lutheran view on polygamy? Well, to quote Luther, advise it, I will not. Condemn it, I cannot. Polygamy is not a sin. It is a bad thing, and in many Western countries it is outlawed, and therefore it would be a sin to commit, because that would be a sin against the fourth commandment, since it is illegal to have more than one wife in this country. Yet if we lived in a world that did allow polygamy, we can't condemn it as Christians. It is bad. It is a social evil, and we should discourage it, never advise it, and would always recommend monogamy. But the Bible and Luther said that polygamy is not a sin. It's bad, but not a sin. And only in cases of like pastors is it absolutely forbidden. Pastors cannot be polygamous. Pastors must be the husband of one wife, and that is final. So I hope that answers the question. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye, and God bless.